All right, paper number 1. Some of you are looking forward to the opportunity to demonstrate how much you know and how well you can write and to weave it all together. Some of you are thinking, great, this is going to be a struggle. I'm here to both excite the people who are looking forward to writing the paper even a little more, and perhaps for the much larger majority who are not looking forward to it, to give you a sense of ease that this is a project that if you plan it out well, is easy to execute. But planning is key here. I would make a guarantee that if you start this project a day before it's due, it's not nearly going to be as good as someone who gets a jump start on it a week or maybe even 2. You have 2 weeks in advance. So I really recommend you watch this video, you take some notes, you take a look at the sources that I'm asking you to use, and you begin planning your paper. So let me show you where you can find all this material. There is a new module called paper number 1, and you'll notice something. I pushed the due date back 2 days. It's now not due until June 28th, it's Sunday, at 5 p.m. So you have a little bit of extra time to work on this paper, which I hope you use to your advantage. It doesn't mean wait to start, it means get started and utilize the extra time. So if you open up this module, you will notice that there are a couple of things in here. This area here, paper number 1, that is solely the submission area. You need to upload a file. Please note, I prefer, if you use Microsoft Word, I really prefer you to upload a Word doc. I'm going to download everyone's Word docs and use the comments feature to give everyone feedback on both their ideas and on their writing. So I'm going to be using track changes. So I really prefer a Microsoft Word doc. Please use that if you can. If you're someone who doesn't use Microsoft Word, submitting a PDF works well. But everyone else, I really hope you submit Microsoft Word so you can get feedback from me. That's the reason to use it, nothing else. So you'll submit here by June 28th at 5 p.m. The second part down here is what you really want to focus on. These are the instructions. So I'm opening up the instructions for you. You can download them. It's a PDF file. And I titled this paper, "The Different Torrents from Whence the River Arose," which is a line that comes from one of a famous abolitionists about the history of abolition. And what we're looking at in the first paper is arguments for abolition. I think that, looking at slavery and abolition is really important in understanding the first half of this course, which is what the paper is measuring. How well you can put together different ideas from the first half of the course, from weeks really 1, 2, 3, and maybe even a little bit of 4, but mostly 1, 2, and 3. How well can you synthesize empire building, colonization, slavery, revolution and abolition, right? These are the things I'm asking you to consider. And I give you like a little bit of background here, but you please do read this because it's important, but I'm going to skip ahead to really the instructions. Your first paper assignment asks you to look at 3 abolitionist primary sources. Remember, primary sources are documents that were created during the period that's under study. So the first is Samuel Sewall's The Selling of Joseph, which comes from 1700. Then there are 2 excerpts from William Wilberforce's Abolition Speech, which was 89 years later in 1789. And then the next comes from the 19th century, Frederick Douglass's famous What to the Slave is the 4th of July from 1852. All 3 of these documents are pieces of abolitionist literature. And although they're all inherently anti-slavery, they're very, very different from each other. This paper assignment should help. I hope by now you really understand how I view history and what the historian does. You might have friends who are really good at saying, oh, this happened on this day in this year, and this person was this. They're not historians, right? They're good at memorizing facts. They're good at what we call being an armchair historian, the people who sit back in their armchair and say, did you know that in 1776, or did you know? Those people aren't historians, right? That's not what a historian does. A historian engages in debate, and they build arguments from looking at primary sources. And so that's what I have you do. You're looking at 3 pieces of literature that are inherently anti-slavery, but I'm not asking you to talk about what they have in common. That's easy. Anti-slavery. Someone could sit there and tell you, did you know Samuel Sewall wrote The Selling of Joseph in 1700? This was arguably the first piece of English literature, anti-slavery literature, right? Yeah, okay, great. That's fantastic. But what can we learn if we juxtapose Samuel Sewall's The Selling of Joseph with William Wilberforce's Abolition Speech with Frederick Douglass's To What to the Slave is the 4th of July speech? Right? All of them are anti-slavery, but they're different in how they present their arguments. So the exact prompt is this: having read the anti-slavery literature of Samuel Sewall, William Wilberforce, and Frederick Douglass, explain how each argues against slavery in its own unique way. Also, be sure to explain which piece creates the best argument against slavery and why. So clearly this last part is an opinion piece. The first part of the question asks you to juxtapose these three anti-slavery writers and identify how they argue against slavery in different ways. Then once you've set that up, I'm asking you to tell me which one you think is best and why. Although that latter part is an opinion piece, the best way to argue it is to demonstrate from your previous writing facts and information and differences that build up your argument. So I'm really looking forward to reading these. My advisor, a historian I worked under, said the best type of history comes when you compare things that are seemingly the same, looking for differences. And so that's what I'm asking you to do. You're looking at three pieces of literature that, if you just gave it to the average person, it would be like they're the same, but you're working to be historians. So you're trying to highlight, actually, they might be anti-slavery, but they're different in specific ways. Here's what those things are. Here's why they matter. And then here's why I think one of them is better than the others. So you can have fun with this, right? Really, we're looking for contrasting twins, but we're also looking for you to pull out your own opinion after you've done the analysis. So I give you here 3 to 5 pages, right? I prefer Times New Roman font, size 12, 1-inch margins all the way around, the standard here. For citation style, this always becomes a problem in my classes because people know different forms. So we're not going to use an official citation style at all. I'm not going to be taking points off so long as you attempt to cite. And here's how I give you a format for citation. I want them in text. Historians use footnotes, but I always find students don't really understand how to use footnotes. So if you get into a higher level class and you learn how to footnote, that's great, but that's not my job for this course. So we're going to use in-text citations, which means you put within parentheses the source from which you're pulling from, and I gave you a way to do it. I want to emphasize this. There is no outside research necessary for this paper, right? In fact, I highly discourage you from doing too much outside research. Look here, if you really want to do some, I'll give you some. Here's background on Sewall, here's some information on Wilberforce, and here's some information on Douglas's famous speech. If you want to do outside research because you're like, listen, Professor, I can't write about Samuel Sewall, I don't know who he is. Fair enough. Here's some information about him, and you can read there, and you can look into a few other things. But I don't want you to be pulling a ton of information about these people because you're not writing a summative paper. That is, you're not trying to tell me who Sewall was. To be honest, I don't really quite care. I'm more interested in his arguments. Same with Wilberforce, same with Douglas. And these are things that you have to recognize. I'm looking for your own personal analysis. Everyone's going to be different, right? That's what makes these papers so interesting for me to read. I'm not just writing you to write tell me who William Wilberforce was, and that's your paper. That's easy. That's what a high school, even elementary student can do. I'm looking for you to be the historian. That's why you're in a university class studying history. You be the historian here. Compare primary sources that seem the same, looking for differences. And I develop your own unique analysis. You can find a rubric for how I'm going to grade in the rubric section on Canvas, so please pay attention to that. I give you some other random suggestions here. First and foremost, forget what you learned in a creative writing class. This isn't a creative writing assignment. This is an analytical piece. You're trying to be a historian. So perhaps go on to JSTOR and read some pieces of historical literature to understand what historians sound like. But we're not trying to write flowy, flowery language here. I'm really looking for analysis in this first paper. The second paper might change things up a bit. For this first one, I definitely want analysis. Don't use contractions, right? Don't is do not. Can't is cannot. So on and so forth. Proofread. How many of you have already gotten comments from me that you need to do better at proofreading, right? Papers look a certain way. They're broken into paragraphs. They have thesis statements. They have arguments. They use sources. They have citations, right? You need to present this. They're well read and they're proofread. So you need to present all of this to me. Another piece of advice I'm going to give a lot of you, because I've noticed this already in your weekly responses: keep your sentences simple. Long sentences don't mean stronger arguments, and they definitely don't mean that you've thought through the material better. In fact, it's normally quite the opposite. Someone who creates this sentence that's 4, 5, 6 lines long is normally someone who's rushing to meet the deadline, trying to fill page. It's equally powerful to write simply as it is to write long, powerful sentences. You can do that if you're familiar with it. A lot of you do not know how to use the semicolon. The fun thing about a semicolon is you never need it. It can always be replaced by a period. So, if you're someone who doesn't know how to use a semicolon, just totally drop it. Don't try to write these long sentences. Just break them down into simple sentences. It's always a good piece of advice. And last, see me if you're having trouble. By see me, this is an online course, send me an email. We can set up a time to meet either via Skype or some other material here, or we can correspond via email. Works well for me too. What other piece of advice do I have? Well, let's go back to our module and just look here. You can see I have a link to the Selling of Joseph, William Wilberforce abolition speech, and Frederick Douglass's speech here too. So if you're thinking, hey, where do I find these things I have to read? Simply click these links and they will take you to the collections. Here's Sewell's Selling of Joseph. You'll notice it's fairly short. I think if you printed it out, it comes to about 3 pages. If we go back and we look at William Wilberforce's abolition speech, again, fairly short, comes to be about, I think, 4 pages if we pull this all out. And you want to read these, right? And you don't just want to just skim them. You want to be reading these actively. So what does active reading mean? It means that as you're going along, you're highlighting, right? I recommend you try to get these things printed out so you can put your own notes on them. If not, you have an accompanying Word doc where you're making notes. And you're noticing as you're reading similarities and differences between them. And you want to really highlight those differences. What are they and why do they exist, right? Why does Wilberforce use a different tactic than Sewell? Why does Douglass's piece read much different from either Sewell or Wilberforce, right? Active reading will help you create a list of notes that you then can transfer into a paper. And finally, you can follow this link to Frederick Douglass's To the Slave, What is the 4th of July. Again here, slightly longer Douglass's, but you probably have a pretty good idea about what he's trying to say early on. I think this one printed out comes to about 7 or 8 pages. So there's a decent amount of reading to do. However, I think once you start doing it and actively read, the differences become apparent pretty early on. So you want to highlight what those differences are as you go to build your paper. Another piece I'm going to add to the module is another list of suggestions, and this comes from a totally different course that I taught this last year, and they were writing a paper on the Odyssey, Homer's The Odyssey. This is about ancient Greece. It's a Western civilization course. So the specifics in here you can feel free to ignore, but the advice is still the same. How can you create a strong paper? Well, the first thing, and this goes directly to our rubric, is you need a strong thesis statement, right? This paper asks for what the differences are. So be clear to tell me in your introduction what those are. Don't say, and I'm going to tell you in this paper what the differences are in your introduction, and not tell me, right? Why would you do that, right? Tell your reader right up front what the differences are, and then spend the body paragraphs explaining what they are. Be original and creative, right? I'm not asking for a summary. Sewell says this. Wilberforce says this. Douglass says this. Yes, I know, but skip that stuff, right? Don't give me a large biography on each of them. Tell me how their arguments differ, even though they're all talking about anti-slavery, right? Use resources that are available to you to perfect your writing. Your voice. For the most part, you want to avoid personal pronouns, although I do ask for your opinion. So it's fine to say, hey, I think the best argument is blank because. Fine to use it there. Don't talk about we's and you's. Who are these we's and you's? I don't know who you're talking about, right? Me? Certainly not. You're not writing about me. Avoid the contractions, right? Avoid cliche. Nothing says, I don't know what I'm talking about, quite like all throughout history. That's just not a good line to use, right? Because historians don't trace all throughout history. We trace differences. Integrate your quotes seamlessly. They shouldn't just be like thrown into random paragraphs if you're going to quote. Double space after periods, by the way. It's dead, folks. Try to get rid of it. Your words, right? Be very careful on your word choice. Word choice is very important to presentation of ideas. And we're not using footnotes, so you can actually totally ignore the footnote style. I look forward to reading these papers. Like I said, any questions, please send them to me. Good luck.